Welcome our viewers to the Gadisa Rabadori discussion on the border issue in Ethiopia. In recent months, the Ethiopian government has hurtled from one crisis to another. It has gone from a massive and prolonged anti-regime protest to a state of emergency that lasted nearly a year, to an arbitrary tax hike that provoked total economic boycott and a stay-at-home campaign that brought everything to a standstill. Lately, the government is facing border clashes mainly between the two regions of the federation that have raised questions about the viability of the government altogether. Is the border issue a sign of state fragility? This is a topic of our discussion today. And joining me in this discussion are from Melbourne, Australia, Dr. Tsaggai Ararsa, a constitutional law scholar and a legal political analyst, and from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Jawar Mohammed, executive director of the Oromia Media Network and a political analyst. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you, Scale. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, let's go at it. I think one of the things that we need to do in discussing this border issues is to refine our terminology. It's been referred to, the incidents around especially the Oromia region, is being referred to in the media in many different ways. Invasion, clash, border dispute, ethnic conflict, and other nomenclature. Dr. Tsaggai, let me start with you. What is happening? What is the historical and political context for this? Any political changes that precipitated it? Anything else that you would say as far as who is involved in it and how should we characterize all of this? And if you can, situate our viewers spatially, if possible.
Oh, thank you. These are big questions. It will take me a whole class to respond to all of the questions, but let's start with the terminologies, as you indicated. There has been a number of words thrown around to describe the situation. People have talked about invasions, we've talked about clashes, disputes, or ethnic conflicts. The regime in particular wants to describe it as an ethnic conflict between ethnic Somalis and Oromos. I think it is important to remember that this is not really about ethnic conflict. There are no warring ethnic groups that are at conflict at the moment. There naturally exists conflicts over mainly resources such as water resources and grazing, land. That has been there always because it is tied to the nature of the economic system, the ecosystem, the interdependence of these two regions and the overlapping interests there. But that conflict now is taking a different direction because of its being extremely militarized and backed by the state. Let's not confuse this with an ethnic conflict. This is not a conflict between the Oromo people and the Somali people. It is also not as much a border conflict as a conflict between the resentful Oromo public that is in the middle of a long staying revolution and the regime in power, which is recalcitrant, which is not listening to what people are demanding, which tried to conduct different kinds of suppression of this movement, including the use of declaration of emergency, which couldn't calm down the protest going on. So from what I see, it is an act of violent repression of the protest. It is an extension of the violent repression, the suppression of the revolution. It is, yes, there is a border conflict, no doubt about it. But it is raised at this point in time as a fabricated kind of conflict staged by the TPLF to do a number of things. The first, to destabilize the region, the Oromia region, which is basically the site of so many resistance movements over the last 2 years and more. And second, it wants to distract the attention of the Oromo public, in particular, the Oromo youth, the Kero, and to deflect the resistance. And thirdly, it wants also, in a vengeful way, to humiliate the youth and to arrest the revolution. They tried co-optation, that couldn't work. They tried repression, that couldn't work. Because as you can see, after even the emergency declaration has been used and the regime has used all its resources to repress the revolution, what happened is that just last week, we've been having a boycott, a stay-at-home protest, and so on and so forth. So nothing could stop that revolution. No co-optation, they talked about economic revolution, nothing could stop it. So what they are trying to do is to come at it from the borders by using the special forces of the Somali region. It's not even a regional force. It was meant to terrorize the region into submission under EPRDF, to use that as a proxy for getting back at the Oromo people and the Oromo region. It was also a way of regaining legitimacy among the wider Ethiopian public and in the international community as an agent of peace among warring ethnic groups. Because there is this idea that the EPRDF promotes about the difficulty of managing the country, keeping peace in the country without the existence of EPRDF. So it is a conflict that emerges, that revolves around border issues, but it is not really essentially a border issue. It is a counter-protest measure, in my view, taken by the regime to repress the conflict, the revolution. As I always insisted, it is an act of state terror meant to exact submission from the Oromo public. It is what we see actually. Yes, there is a conflict, but the main conflict here is a confrontation between, as I said, the resentful Oromo public on the one hand, and a very stubborn, recalcitrant regime that is not willing to listen to the public's demand. If there is any conflict, therefore, it is between the people and the region. It's the regime. It's the people on the one hand and the regime on the other. To be sure, of course, there are disputes over, as I said, over various border resources, but it has always been there. There have been traditional elders who resolve this dispute. There are different ways of diplomatic, traditional, local diplomatic, political, and traditional ways of resolving it. But this time, the conflict took on a different range, a different shape and form, because it is very much militarized by the regime. There is a highly mechanized, specialized force that's behind it. The Ethiopian Defense Forces are mobilized behind it. And it's really being conducted as a war, almost as a full-scale war. High machineries involved, and so on and so forth. For me, this is EPRDF's way of governing writ large. From the very start, this is a regime that began with violence, and there is, of course, historical violence that is embedded in that state. Remember, the EPRDF took power at the moment when the state crisis was manifested in Ethiopia. And there were so many contradictions that led to the state crisis. The EPRDF, instead of resolving those contradictions, contained them, held them to itself, and from time to time continued to cash them out in order to continue to exist in power. So in a way, this conflict is a fabricated conflict. It's a conflict that the state kind of cashes out. There has always been these kinds of conflicts, low-intensity conflicts that the EPRDF always acted out in order to make itself relevant as a force for peace. But this is only another way of manipulating inherent contradictions in the state, in the nature of the Ethiopian state, that also brought about the state crisis, and it continues to rule through crisis. And it is a way of making oneself relevant as an agent of peace in a very volatile state of violence. It's a rule of violence writ large.
Well, thank you so much. That helps quite a lot. But to recapitulate, that there was a year-long protest in the country. Government has tried so many different ways to suppress it: economic, political reform measures, economic issues, and many other ways, including a state of emergency, which did not suppress the protest. Now that it is using existing tensions between the Somali and the Oromo, exploiting existing tensions to become relevant and as a countermeasure to suppress the protests. But they are basically, what they are doing is, from what you're saying, that this is politics writ large. This is a militarization of politics. But Jawar, could you help us more by talking about who the actors are right now and what is the scale of this conflict on the ground?
Thank you. I think Sagai has said quite, much of the rationale behind this conflict. I want to add a little bit on what he has said. What is the objective, the TPLF's objective behind these clashes? We shouldn't just focus on the clashes that have been happening in recent months following the Oromo protest, but this is a strategic undertaking of the TPLF since it came to power. We must recall that this area, the border areas, the Borona, Bale, Hararge areas, were the backbone of the OLF activities, the military activities, both for the Oromo Liberation Front as well as for Ogadini National Liberation Front. When it came to power and when it pushed these rebel groups from the transitional government, the TPLF knew that they will retreat back into these lowland areas, these pastoralist communities, and so they will relaunch their armed struggle. So they wanted to make sure that there is no fertile ground for insurgency in the region. This is written in Malas's book, and CA and all of these people have been writing about it. So what's the best way to make it difficult for insurgents to move among the communities? And as we know, the two insurgents used to collaborate, used to cooperate in the region. So if you can stop conflict between the Somali and Oromo communities across the border, you create animosity, and that animosity makes it difficult for insurgents from either side to move across the border. They were quite successful in the 90s in this regard, because it became really difficult for both rebel groups to pass through the borders. Move forward, around 2004, the Ogaden National Liberation Front re-emerged with much more with much more strength, and launched some spectacular attacks against the government installations. It is then that this Liu police paramilitary is formed. I'm heading to show why this is not just a war against Oromos. The Liu police was established to put over Somali fire with Somali fire. After years of the National Defense Forces, the Tigrayan generals trying to suppress resentment and rebellion in Ogaden region, they came up with this solution of recruiting mercenary force from among the Somalis to attack their own Somalis. And they were quite successful because they undertook a scorched earth campaign. They committed ethnic cleansing against the Somalis between 2000 and early 2000s until probably 2012 and 13. And they were able to crush the rebellion in that region. They succeeded. Once they succeeded with that, it is in the aftermath of this spectacular success in using this probably 30 to 40,000 strong paramilitary force against the Somalis, the Oromo protest emerges. The Oromo protest emerges and threatens the power holders in Addis Ababa. And their response is to look out. So we must pay attention to what has been discussed during that time. What was Abai Zahaye saying? What was Sarkan saying? What was Suyum Masfin saying? They were saying the Amhara Oromo rebellion and a protest is threatening the Tigrayan domination. Therefore, we need a minority alliance. So they reactivate. And last year, while Oromo protest is happening in Oromia, while Amhara resistance was happening in Amhara region, we find this strange development in Jijiga, where this mad dog Abdi Ile starts to call for rallies, trying to threaten the Oromos, and this threat was followed by in December by emergence of cross-border raid. So it is very important for outsiders, insiders to understand there is no such thing as border conflict. The Oromo and the Somali people, particularly in these border areas, they are indistinguishable. They speak both languages. Of course, as any pastoralist community, there is some clashes from here and there on water wells and other areas. The Somali used to come deep inside Oromia to the area I grew up around Western Aragon, RC area. There was not that much problem. But what we're observing right now is it's not civilians clashing. It is the Liu police, this paramilitary force that committed ethnic cleansing in Somali, crosses to the Oromia border, attacks village, occupies lands, forces Somali pastoralists to come and settle in Oromia. This is very important. The tragedy of this story is we are not even seeing the suffering of the Somalis. They displace Somalis from inside Somali region and they bring them, settle them inside Oromia. Then they become the human shield when the Oromo militias respond in defense against the EU police. So the actors right now, I have published about 2-3 months ago all the commanders who are commanding these things. And we have published ID cards of members of the National Defense Force. Some of them Somali, some of them Tigrayans. We know, in today's Ethiopia, nothing happens without TPLF knowing, particularly security concern. You can have a small protest in Nakamte. Within 30 minutes, the paramilitary commandos, the Agazis will be there. But you have days of fighting on these border areas. You have the Eastern Brigade, the Eastern Command, right there in Hurso, right there in Hararge, never responding until multiple lives are lost. So what we observe in this area is TPLF deliberately militarizing the border areas to create animosity between the Oromos and the Somalis. But it is not just in the Somali border that we are having issues. We are observing the same kind of movement, between Afars and the Wallo Oromos, and the Afars and the Somalis, and the Afars and the Karayu Oromos. In the western border, we are starting to observe strange maps that cut off both Amhara region and Oromia from Sudan, giving these lands to Benishangul and Gambela and connecting them to larger Tigrayan region. And another issue, what is this command issue? You have the command issue, maybe a legitimate national issue, but you have the TPLF getting obsessed and agitating the command committee in Amhara region to attack the Amhara community, the larger Amhara community whom they have lived with for thousands of years. So the idea is to destabilize the restless regions of Amhara and Oromia so that the Oromos and Amharas will be busy fighting the minorities in their region so that they don't pay attention so much into what the TPLF is doing in Addis Ababa and elsewhere.
All right. I think we are historically situated, and Abdi Ile is the president of the Somali regional government, and just wanted to clarify that. But as far as the actors are concerned, we have the special forces that you talked about the origins of. You have other actors like the Ethiopian Defense Forces, but basically what you both are saying is this is a counter-insurgency measure that had already existed for years now, since the TPLF government came to power. Now they are really using that same counter-insurgency measure to try to hem in the protest movement that started in Oromo and Amhara areas. This is important and very surprising, but we can still go into what's going on right now. What is really the current state of affairs right now in the last week or so? What is the latest? Sagai, if you could help us with that. Also speak to the idea of that this is not really the area stretching from Hararge to Borana, but also some other places almost around the state of Oromia, and why this is happening at this point in time.
Yeah, it's the actors in this conflict at the moment Of course, the major protagonist is the special forces, the Liyuhail, special police, which is a paramilitary commando, as Jawar had indicated. And then there is the federal armed forces, which usually are backing them or stand between the people who wanted to fight back against the special forces and kind of keep the people away from getting involved. These federal armed forces at times are found to be disarming the local militia, the Oromia police, and even attacking them while they are trying to defend what they thought is their territory from the special forces. So the protagonists are Abdile's special forces on one hand, and the civilian population on the ground. And then the Oromia police wants to intervene at times, the militia want to intervene, and often the federal armed forces disarm them or come in between and defend the special forces. And one of the things that is very interesting about the special forces actions is that they attack civilians, they take control of offices, they hoist the regional flag, the Somali national regional state flag, and they kind of act as administrators in those local office spaces. And just yesterday, what we have seen in Borana is the young people, the Kero, actually fighting back against these forces and trying to reoccupy the offices that the Somali forces, the special forces of the Somali region had controlled. They also took down the flag that was hoisted there, and they rehoisted the Oromia flag in the offices. What is going on in the last few weeks, well, for the last few months, of course, was mainly an attack and a lot of aggression with very atrocious acts perpetrated against civilian populations in eastern and western Hararghe primarily. Then, which means this is about around the Mieso area, Chenaksen, Bordede, and Mayumuluke, all many districts in these two zones of Hararghe, and then in Borana zone around the Moyale area, and then Western Guji and Guji zone, and then way into Bale. And these are the ones that the special forces are actually attacking at the moment, and people are pushing back against their attacks. As we speak now, in Moyale, there was a lot of action yesterday. There were days reported on both sides, and people going back to reoccupy the places that were invaded. And there is a lot of emotional reaction to the Somali attack, to the special forces attack. I'm sorry, I keep saying Somali, but just because they come from the Somali region. Now, this conflict is tied to the referendum that was conducted in 1997. I will come to touch upon this later when we talk about the legal mechanisms of handling such conflicts. But there was a referendum that happened in years 2004, 2005 in these two places. And often the officials say the conflicts now flare up because of the fact that the results of those referendums were not implemented on the ground, and borders are not delineated, and administrations are not established according to the results of the referendum. There is a lot to be said about the referendum itself as a legal solution. There is not much known in public records whether it was properly conducted or not. But I will come back to the details perhaps later. But there was that issue as well. So the issue of borders has been raised a number of times. Now, of course, it was kind of injected into the whole big picture of conflicts in the country by the regime from time to time, depending on what is threatening its power. 2004, 2005 was the moment of extraordinary election that almost stole away the power from the regime. And it was in the wake of that election that those referenda were conducted and then left unimplemented. So that's one. This is that conflict that arises around the Somali-Oromia border. And then there is, in the western side, well, before that, there is again going on the eastern side, the Afar-Oromia conflict, the Afar-Amhara region conflict, particularly the Oromia zone of the Amhara region, which is Kamise and so on and so forth. This has been going on for some time, again, ignited and activated and prodded by the TPLF from behind. And it is so, we conclude that it is prodded by propelled by the TPLF, because they never took any action to arrest the conflict. They never took, and they always err on the side of the other side, not the Oromo side, and it continues to be an area of very volatile situation at the moment. And then on the western side, there were low-intensity conflicts, intermittent conflicts in the border between Benishangul Gumuz and Oromia, in the border between Gambela and Oromia, and in the border between the South and Oromia, of course. But what's happening nowadays is that Amphilo, for example, from the Elam area, is now kind of put in a map that shows that it is in Gambela. And Gidami in Western Wolaga is now going over to the Benishangul Gumuz area. And then there is another constitutional case that's coming up now from Metekel, from Wombra, from these places. People now are writing a petition to the House of Federation demanding that they be reassigned in Oromia because they are Oromos, ethnic Oromos, wrongly assigned in that region. So there is a host of issues that is coming up around the border. Now, the border issue is not a problem. It has always been there because the borders are not delineated. That starts with the Constitution. That starts with the way the federal system was designed top-down and put down imposed on the people. That starts with the absence of an independent expert body of commissioners that demarcate the borders at the time of forming the federation. That flaw is deliberately conserved and now put to use, exploited as appropriate, opportunistically by the regime, to kind of raise some conflicts, to make the regime relevant as peacemakers, and to deflect other popular demands that are vertically building up to topple down the government. Maybe I will say more on the details later.
Well, thank you. So when we're talking about borders, we're not talking about international boundaries. We're actually talking about borders between emerging federal units. And that is an important point to underscore because, as you just said, the founding of the federation is almost 26 years old. Normally, these borders should have been delineated and demarcated by now, but the government kind of reserved it because they really wanted to use as a political weapon in case that is needed. Now, but to highlight the points, what we're saying here is that this is not an ethnic conflict. It's not at least an ethnic conflict between the Somali and the Oromo residents of these areas. They've always lived together. In fact, what Jawar said is important because it's not. What it shows is that there is a ethnic boundary or border where people from both sides, from the Oromo and the Somali side, actually speak both languages. It's a place of transition. So they articulate, they share cultures, they share borders, they share grazing land, they live together for millions of years, for thousands of years like that. The second point is that, so if it's not an ethnic conflict, then it is a minority government sanctioned conflict, a government which at the center is facing political, economic, and legitimacy crisis, that it is using this as a weapon to remain relevant, to become an actor, to divide the people that are opposing them, as you said, the protest from below. The third important thing that we really underscore is that the area of action stretches 1,000 kilometers from the area of Hararge all the way to Borana, but not limited to that, but also in the west, but also in the northeast and in other areas. So it is everywhere. It's so clear that it's really government sanctioned, government instigated political action, a militarized political action. This is important. So let's move on to see what a government is supposed to be doing when there are issues like that, to simply underscore that these are all created by the government at the center. Now, who is supposed to be responsible for what when issues like this occur? I'm kind of moving us to discuss government response in the normal state of scheme of things. Who is responsible for what? What is the federal government supposed to do? What is the Oromia government supposed to do? What are the jurisdictional issues? So that we can clarify this in a way that our viewers can understand. Could we start with Jawar? How was this the government's response? Is government at any level doing what it is supposed to do?
I think the guy can say a lot more on the legal aspect of it, but from my understanding, institutionally there are actually institutions specifically designed to address if there is, let's say there is that so-called border conflict between two regions. We have Council of Federations, the one chamber of the legislative at the federal level. Even beyond that, we have a ministry called Federal Affairs Ministry that's supposed to handle this. And we don't see these people acting. Let me, the responsibility to protect. The failure of the federal government is so obvious. This conflict started in December. What was happening in Ethiopia in December? The country was under state of emergency, let alone going across a border and staging attack. No, civilians were not allowed to gather for more than 3 people by the decree of the state of emergency. Not only that, the state of emergency put, and I want people to pay attention to this, the state of emergency put all security forces, local, regional, federal, under the direct control of the command post under the federal government. This conflict was raging in December, January, February, March, while the state of emergency was still active. In Finfinne, you could not have a shirt that has any anti-government sentiment. In Chiro, you could not have a meeting. But just down in Chinaksan, you can mount your machine guns on pickups and cross a border 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers deep into another regional state, wage a war, and go back, and 30 kilometers away is the headquarters of the Eastern Command Post. What does that tell you? When we say the federal government or those who are in charge of the federal government, that is the TPLF, is behind this conflict, we are not talking conspiracy theories. We are talking about real things that are happening. So this issue has not been brought up at the Council of Federation. It's not. After what, 4 or 5 months of bloodshed, where an estimated 600 people died from both sides of the border, then we see the federal Ministry of Federal Affairs brings the president of the 2 regions, and they shake hand and they reach agreement. No one gets punished. No one is held responsible. These are official paramilitary forces crossing and killing civilians. We know who is killing who. These are uniformed soldiers with government issued IDs and weapons coming and killing people. The judiciary did nothing. The legislative did nothing. We only saw president of the 2 regions shaking hand and saying peace will be restored. We have agreed on borders, and they promised nobody else will die again. Then about 2-3 weeks later, 2-3 weeks ago, we see again the reeruption of what's happening, and we see no action whatsoever from the federal government. In fact, Very, very strange thing happened in Mieso a couple of days ago. The Liu police comes deep inside the region, attacks a city and residents, kills children. And when the local police reacted to protect civilians, we have them on videos, the federal army disarming and beating local police. So what this shows us is not just negligence of the federal government, in fact, an active collaboration. In fact, beyond collaboration, there is strong evidence to show that they are behind, they're the ones who are orchestrating this situation. So the federal authorities from the legislative side, from the security side, are not active. I mean, this is an authoritarian government where security issues are the most paramount of importance to the regime. Today in Borana and Bale, we have wars. Over 100 people died in Bale and Borana yesterday and today. This does not happen in Ethiopia. It doesn't happen unless those in control of the country want it to happen. So the federal authorities have miserably failed, did not only fail, but they are actually fully responsible for the bloodshed.
So, Guy, anything that you could add, like to the legal, the constitutional responsibilities of governments?
Yeah. If I may backtrack a little bit about the causes of the conflict, you know, the immediate cause, of course, is the aggression by the special forces. And of course, then they talk about the unimplemented results of the referendum of 2004 and so on and so forth. The structural cause actually is the nature of EPRDF in its act of trading in fear and terror. It is the nature of EPRDF rule as a rule of violence. That is the cause. And I talk about these things because when we talk about responsibility now of arresting this conflict, it is important who is behind it in the first place. And like Jawar has said, there is ample evidence to show that the federal government activates, initiates, supports, and looks away when special forces actually perpetrate horrendous atrocities on civilians, children, women, evicted them out of place. They even, reports suggest that there is also rape and so on and so forth. Now, what are the responsibilities? How should it have been responded to? I think the primary responsibility is that of the federal government, of course. The Prime Minister, the federal executive body generally, had the primary responsibility, the most urgent responsibility, to arrest the violence, to bring a halt to it, and to stop the violence, and then protect the civilians. That is constitutional responsibility. If they can't do this, they have literally failed to govern. Peace and security is the very basic minimum that any government, let alone such an authoritarian government which prides itself of having the most well-built military in the sub-Saharan Africa, it is a very primary responsibility. And I think, given the fact that they have always been very effective in controlling every space in the regions or in the cities and everywhere, they could have done whatever they can in order to put a halt to this. And they haven't. They haven't because there is no will. In fact, it looks like it is their own kind of war. Remember, this is a government that thrives and survives in conflicts. It kind of, when Marara said in 1993 in an article that Ethiopia is going from crisis to crisis through crisis, we thought it would end at some point. It didn't. It continues to be going through crisis. And the regime is very comfortable in living through crisis and manipulating fears and spreading terror and continuing to stay in power. So it trades in fear and terror. That's what wanted to say. They kind of activate fear of different sectors of society, and historical mistrusts are manipulated to flare up some fear and sense of terror so that they can continue to stay in power. Now, in terms of responsibility, apart from the federal executive body, normally when there is an inter-regional and interstate conflict, the immediate body that has to deal with this was an Intergovernmental Relations Commission. Now, in Ethiopia, there is no such formal Intergovernmental Relations Commission. There is no but there are different institutions that take up this responsibility. The first institution, of course, is the House of Federation. The House of Federation normally takes up this kind of cases through adjudication. There are diplomatic responsibilities, political ways of resolving the dispute, meaning under Article 62 of the Constitution, the House of Federation has the responsibility to ensure that peace and brotherhood is maintained among peoples, that all conflicts are resolved in a peaceful manner, that people are brought together, discuss and talk about their problems, and they establish a joint committee to resolve joint problems and so on and so forth. So that is the political diplomatic responsibility of the House of Federation. The second thing it does is that when the regions are in conflict, then it will decide on it. It will do an adjudication role, especially in areas areas related to boundaries, territories, and so on and so forth. Now, when it does that, of course, it doesn't decide by itself. It facilitates decision by the people. And how does that, it does this? Normally, the way it does is based on the Constitution. The Constitution puts down 4 major criteria based on which people are assigned to a particular region and regional boundaries are established. These are language, identity, settlement pattern, and consent of the people concerned. This is Article 46 sub 2. Language, identity, settlement pattern, and consent of the peoples concerned. Now, the major lacking thing in the whole ways of forming the whole constituent units of the Federation between 1992 and 1995 is the consent thing, because people were never consulted, submissions were never made, and it was just arbitrarily, well, not entirely arbitrarily, because they followed the map drawn by the Institute of Nationalities, and there were politicians which formed a commission that kind of negotiated which has to belong to where, but people were not in the picture. Now, these people were trapped, some of them are trapped in different boundaries, the things that we see in Wolkite, the things that we see in between different areas in the southern, between the border of the southern region and the Oromia region, the Oromos in Benishangul Gumuz, and so on and so forth. So because people were not consulted, in the wake of the federal constitution's adoption, people find themselves in a region that they never thought they belonged to. And so they demand reassignment. And with that, they want to move the border. And this kind of decisions were supposed to be resolved through democracy at the beginning. So the original lack of democracy is always constantly destabilizing the whole thing. Now, when this is the problem, the House of Federation, based on these 4 major sets of criteria, tries to facilitate popular referendum. And they, within 2 years, they organize a referendum, and based on the results of the referendum, those boundaries will be delineated and settled. Now, the House of Federation this is a very long process, like all legal solutions to conflicts. It takes a long time. It is required that first, peace is established, that forces are demobilized, that armed people are disarmed, that normalization has taken place, de-escalation has taken place before processing the legal, going through the legal procedure. So that is the House of Federation. Now, the other institution, and of course it has got its own committees, its legal committees, border committee, I mean, those kinds of committees, and they should be active and they should be looking at these things. Then there is the House of Federation, the Ministry of Federal Affairs. Now, unfortunately, Ministry of Federal Affairs now wants to play out as an agent that does intergovernmental relations. But it was established in order to control the regions. Basically, it was an institution that was meant to control the regions, to make sure that the regions are subservient to the federal government. So it was not very efficient in resolving disputes among regions. It was not very efficient. In fact, there is also an overlap of power between the House of Federation and the conflict department of the Ministry of Federal Affairs. But gradually it is evolving into an intergovernmental relations institution. But again, because the federal government is behind this conflict, it cannot forward the case to the House of the Ministry of Federal Affairs and do anything substantive in order to resolve the conflict in this way. Because the EPRDF, let's remember, conserves conflicts wherever they flare up. They conserve and capitalize on them, and they cash them out as necessary opportunistically. So what the Ministry of Federal Affairs should have done is to broker negotiation, to offer its good offices, to bring people together, and to find the terms of disagreements, and then sort out which ones have to be resolved legally, which ones have to be resolved through security measures, which ones have to be resolved through political measures. Now, why is this now becoming a very difficult matter? Traditionally, the regime solved all conflicts, federalism conflicts, through one body, which is the political party. So what they do is they organize a peace and democracy conference. So they bring people and they tell them top down exactly what should be done. And then they go apart, and the political parties in the regions, affiliates or EPRDF coalition members, they implement the decision. When that is not working, and there are times when they are not working, they gather up traditional elders, okay, advisory councils, advisory elders council, and they bring the Gurti, for example, from the Somali region. They bring the Abagadas from the Oromia region. They bring similar institutions in the Afar, and then they send them to bring peace through blessings and curses and so on and so forth, because they can't handle, they don't have legitimacy to do it. And they kind of bring peace. Because I remember when there was a conflict between the Digodia clan of the Somali and the Borana of the Oromo around year 2000. They had a big conflict, and there were deaths and so on and so forth. And this was reported to the federal government, and the federal police and the federal army came. They couldn't solve much of it. Okay, during the day they mobilize the army, they deploy the army, people are quiet. But during the night, when the army goes back to the barracks, the people fight. And because there is some justice to be done, relations must be healed and so on and so forth. But then one night they saw on TV the presidents of the two regions shaking hands and saying, politically, this has been resolved. And the elders, I was talking to the Gurti there, the elders said, well, we are the ones who fought. Here are the people who fought. But these are the presidents who shake hands, signing peace deal. And they never fought in the first place. Why would they shake hands anyway? And so they began to work. And because their shaking hands doesn't mean much among the people, the elders had to go to work on the ground. And so when their action is not being heard among the people, they mobilize the traditional elders. And in fact, in year 2000, between year 2000 and 2004, they rewrote the regional constitutions to make sure that there is a constitutional institution called Advisory Elders Council in the Afar, Somali, Benishangul, everywhere. And so these were the ways of solving the conflict. Now, that is not mobilized in this case because the federal government doesn't want it to be solved, doesn't want the problem to be solved. The states, well, what they do is not normally to mobilize army and defend themselves. The states, what they do is to report to each other, to exchange information among their security offices, the peace and security offices, then as ጸጥታና አስተዳደር Bureau, and they kind of try to resolve the situation by going to the place. Now, if they can't solve that, one of the states or both might demand constitutionally a federal intervention. When there is a security issue, a constitutional crisis that is beyond the capacity of the regions, what they do is they invite the federal government through an intervention. One of the tasks of the House of Federation is to order a federal intervention in the regions. For example, to suspend local militia and police temporarily and mobilize the federal police, the federal police primarily, not the army. The army is meant to protect the external borders. So that way they arrest the conflict. Now that is not happening. So what is happening now? The response became the response of the residents. The residents, because they are the ones that are attacked, they have only themselves to defend themselves. So they are taking up arms when they can. They are just using their basic agricultural implements when they can't to fight back against the people that are perpetrating atrocities on them. The reason is because the regime does not want this conflict to be resolved, because it is the regime's conflict with the people.
Well, thank you. That's very important. I think one of the things that you said and that I really need to underscore so that people understand what's going on is, you said at the beginning, Dr. Sagai, that this is the nature of the EPRDF government, that this is the way it functions, this is the way it has always functioned. And when we say the EPRDF government, we're not really speaking to the idea that the EPRDF itself is, of course, a coalition of parties, but the core of the party is the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It's the TPLF, is the core. Others are simply surrogate organizations to give a semblance of coalition and representation of all ethnic groups. So what we mean by that is when you say, I understand you mean to say that the nature of the EPR government is the core, is the TPLF, and that's a minority government that is using all kinds of ways to pit one group against another, one ethnic group against another, and that's the way it can only survive. This is not true of the TPLF alone. It happens everywhere else in the world where a minority group that doesn't have a demographic weight in any country rules. That's the way you perpetuate yourself in power. Secondly, you both have made a case using evidence, using responsibilities, that the EPRDF government or the federal government in Ethiopia is not looking away. It's not a matter of a dereliction of duty. This government intervenes, but intervenes on the side of fanning conflicts.
Yes.
That is what Jawar was saying, that it intervenes to incite, to sow conflict, to intensify conflict, because that's the only way it could operate and survive politically. So it's important to say that this is not a question of lack of capacity. It is one of the largest military and security conscious government. It has that capacity to stop it. It's not a matter of legal constraints. It's actually the responsibility of the federal government when there are disputes between two regions to resolve it politically, diplomatically, and intervene if there is a conflict. It's not about respecting jurisdictional differences or political responsibilities. It is the responsibility of the federal government to get in when situations like this flare up. It's not preferring diplomacy, like using, as you just said, elders to resolve issues, because they are there and they are not being assembled. It is two presidents that are just hugging each other and signing papers and declare that everything is at peace. It is not a fear of escalation of the war. They are fanning it. They're contributing it, not only in these areas that are being talked about, but actually expanding it. And Jawad talks about the grand scheme of this government to continue to stay in power. So in a way that people should understand, that this government is not just an accomplice on one side, it is the author of these conflicts. This is the way it deals with, perpetuates itself on power. Now, one more question before we move on, and Jawar could speak to this. The president of Oromia says that there are complicating factors that militate against settlement, and he talks about non-state actors, other actors who are exploiting the situation for their own private purposes, like contraband traders, ethnic entrepreneurs, land grabbers, unstated, and others, other groups. And he's saying that those are the ones that are making it difficult. To what extent could this be taken as valid? Is there any truth to what the president is saying?
That is ironic. If there is one conflict in Ethiopia where there is no non-state actor involved, it is this conflict. Why? Because that's one of the most highly militarized. It has, outside the Eritrean border, an area that's under 24-hour surveillance and heavy military presence in Ethiopia, the eastern region. The Somali regional state have been under pretty much undeclared martial law since 1991, particularly since 1994, since OMN left. The region is, I grew up in that area. Yes, there used to be contraband in that area. There used to be a lot of contraband coming through Hard Sheikh, through Bikke, through the Redawa. But it doesn't come anymore. Now contraband comes straight from Mochale, straight from Hard Sheikh, straight from Somaliland. It goes to Addis Ababa. Guess who dominate that? The military generals. It is controlled by the military generals. This is a public knowledge, by the way. There is no longer contraband market in the Redawa. There is no longer Taiwan market. Every contraband that comes into Ethiopia through this eastern border passes through the military into Addis Ababa. And any contraband that goes down, like the dollars they captured in Bordeaux, also is carried by people who are affiliated with the military. No businessman dares to do contraband in this region because that means signing your own death warrant. So I don't know where Lamma is, pulling that from, but the idea that there are some non-state actors involved. In which side do the non-state actors involved? We know who is fighting. It's not like, let's say if the Somali communities and the Oromo communities are fighting, you would say there are these contraband traders who want to sell weapons, who want to make money involved, But that's not the case. This is a government-armed, government-organized paramilitary force known as Liu Police, whose commanders we know. They are bragging on Facebook everywhere about their killings. Was the regional president officially commands, whose Ethiopian state security and military recognizes as the protector of the region against any attempt from the Somalis side. So those who are waging this war from the Somali region side are not Somali pastoralists. These are not normal Somalis. These are part of the Ethiopian government security branch. By the way, they are not local police and they are not militias. I've seen some media refer to them like militia. I mean, all Kabbales, all these districts have militias in Ethiopia, but only Somali region has special forces. And the justification for rationale for organizing this paramilitary force was, one, domestically, they justified saying they needed to use it to crush the ONLF, the Ogaden Liberation Front. Internationally, remember, initially this paramilitary force was funded and trained by the British military support. And they were telling them, oh, look, Al-Shabaab is trying to come through Somalia. We need to seal the border off. And the best way to do it is to use a military force that speaks Somali. So we know who is fighting. There is no contraband involved. There is no third party involved. The rebel movement in that area have been decimated. They're not there anymore. So, unless Lamma is insinuating about what we are talking about, unless he is scared of saying, yeah, the TPLF military generals, General Abraha's quarter and all these people, unless he is considering them as contraband traders, There cannot be a civilian contraband trader in that area. You can't have a contraband trader in Sudan border. You can have contraband trader probably maybe in the Moyale area a little bit on the Kenyan border. In Somali region, Oromia borders, let alone contraband, he cannot move. I mean, there are kellas. There are this stop and search areas almost every 10 kilometers in this region. You cannot, even civilians cannot pass without IDs. So the idea that there is some boogeyman, some weird non-state actor involved in that area is totally a fabrication. Well, what we've seen from evidence, for example, today I was posting, today the Boronas killed a major from Somali National Army, because almost half of these Liu police soldiers are actually not from Ogaden. Most of them are recruited, veterans of the civil war, the warlord fighting in Somalia. Once Somalia started to get a little bit stabilized, they needed, just like any mercenaries, they needed a job. They moved across the border and they get recruited, they get hired into this Liu police force. So there is no third parties, there is no, this is clear. We interview residents on both sides, both the Somali side and the Oromo side. The fighting is clearly undertaken by Liu police, who, by the way, Liu police almost on daily basis, they are trained, they are checked, they are monitored by the Eastern Command. So unless Lamma is really pointing finger to the military generals and the intelligence officers, there is no way that there are any other groups involved in this.
It's good that we are eliminating all kinds of possibilities and squarely focusing the responsibility on the federal government, because it is the federal government that is constitutionally, legally, and politically, and then institutionally supposed to be doing something about it. So what we are saying is that this military contrabandists and money laundering, and by the way, I'm also familiar with this contraband trade because I've studied it and I've written about it. In this case, failure not to intervene in a clear way, in a way that the government was supposed to, is by design. It's not that it is failing. It's not lack of capacity or any other consideration that makes the government reluctant. So there is no really failure. It is the design of the government to continue to fan this interstate conflicts. But let's move on. If this is what the government has been doing, that sowing conflict, at this point in time, there are also internal political, economic, and other pressures. How is it that a government that is sitting on a time bomb, that is also facing legitimacy and economic and political problems, how is it going to help this government, or where is it going to go? Dr. Zagai.
Just before I go into that, very quickly, I want to add to what Jawar had mentioned earlier on. The regional president of Oromia, Bolamma, knows perhaps too many details about the security situation of that region. And I assume that he's a little too bogged down to details. There are ghosts that he has been chasing for a long time in that area when he was the chief of security and administration in the region. Back in time, he was for a long time the head of the security department of the region. And Abdile, the current president of the Somali region, he was also the security chief of the region. And in those days, I remember how Lemma was speaking about all these things in extraordinary frankness in front of the federal authorities in conferences, to the extent that he actually irritated so many of them that literally they had to take the mic away from him at some point. In those days, he talks about contraband. He talks about trafficking in weapons in the area. He talks about other extremist groups. Now, this is, of course, the usual line from the government at any level, extremists operating in the region, and so on and so forth. Now, it's very striking that there is this inability now, this fabricated inability on the part of the federal government to control the special forces. But between 2006 and 2000 until today, from what I recall, when I was also working for the UNDP, the strongest military division of Ethiopia, next to the Northern Front, the Northern Division, the Eastern Division, was actually deployed in the Somali region in the name of protecting the defense, the borders from the conflict in Somalia. Now, that 70,000 strong military division operating in the Somali region was basically terrorizing the region into submission, terrorizing the people in order not for them to support the ONLF. One of the things that I noticed personally in the year between 2009, 2010, 11 was that there are 9 zones in the Somali region. From among 9 zones, 5 of them were designated as war zones, and 4 of them were peace zones. And they were basically ruled by a martial law, and it was under the military. And it's very interesting that how sometimes conflict entrepreneurs are born. In some of these war zones get a lot of budget for the local administration because it's a conflict area. So some of the peace zones, they didn't get as much budgetary allocation at the time as the districts in war zones. So one of the things they do is they report that there is war, there is ONLF operating in their area, so that they can get more budget from the Jiga, and so they can get more budget allocated to them from the federal government. That's how much conflict under the military was becoming a household thing, something that they live with. Now, I think Lema Magarsa senses some things that cannot be said in public now as a president. And he just didn't want to expose some groups. And he's trying to play his card safely. And that's why he hesitates to name the real faces of this conflict. He kind of wants to ascribe it elsewhere. And also, of course, naturally kind of bogged down by the details that he knows in the area. Having said that, there are pressures, yes. There are pressures that signal the specter of collapse, as you rightly framed it. And the pressures, of course, are the protests, the responses to the tax hikes, the boycotts that we have seen in the past few weeks, and the stay-at-home protest, the state of emergency that was here for a long time, now lifted, but of course, de facto, it always exists, and so on and so forth. Now, what does this signal to the regime? With all these pressures, can it stand these pressures, and then can it also continue to sponsor this conflict in the borders and survive? Well, as I said, this is a regime that thrives and survives in conflicts. The conflicts are not; they are cashed out reasonably. Now, it's very interesting that, by the way, when the protest against the master plan started in 2014, I wrote a short piece on why resist the master plan. And that piece was directed to the TPLF regime itself, why it is against their own most favored constitutional clauses. And back then they came back on social media to react by saying, what are you talking about? You don't even have a stable border. You know, one day we'll set it on fire and this Oromia thing that you talk about will not be there. And that was the thing they were saying in public on social media, contesting why we shouldn't resist the master plan. Now, it looks like, from what we see, the time has come for them to play this card, to pull out this border issue, the fact that Oromia is bounded by 8 of the the members of the Ethiopian Federation. That because of this, there are some frictions in all corners, and therefore, by bringing some conflict, triggering conflicts in all corners, then you would be forced to resign and forced to accept in whatever way the TPLF wants to rule the country. So will they survive this? I doubt it, because this border conflict already tells you that it has become so tenuous that they cannot go on. You see, they wanted to repress all sorts of protests by violence. They couldn't handle it. They wanted to suppress it through state of emergency. They tried it for 9 months. And when they lifted it up, it was all the same. They now started this conflict on the borders. And what was happening last week? People actually gave them the simplest form, but the most dangerous kind of resistance. They stayed at home. They didn't do anything. They just stayed at home. And if they keep staying at home nationally for 3 more days, I think that regime collapses altogether. And I do not think they can survive this unless in order to make the regime survive, they want the state to collapse. And my hope is that the regime would collapse and the state survives. But I think all political actors need to be very mindful, very, very tactful about how to act in this very difficult time. Because the regime might collapse and the state will survive. If not, the regime will continue to exist and the state might collapse through this kind of machinations.
Yeah, those are kind of difficult concepts to understand, but we'll just conclude it by clarifying that. But let's not be lest that people don't understand that we are really being hyperbolic. Let's say that here is what we see internally. What we see in the border areas is that the states are destabilized purposely by design. Internally, there is political fragmentation. The one thing that the Ethiopian government has been talking about, that is economic growth. There is a downward spiral on of the economy itself for a number of reasons, which we don't want to get into. I think the way the Dr. Sagai, when you say it thrives and it survives on this, sure, the past is not a good guide into the future. It probably have thrived and survived in the past, but some methodologies get old. They will be taken over by forces that you cannot control. So the pressures that we're talking about are economic forces. We're talking about political fragmentation. We're also talking about diplomatic isolation. The doctrine of the isolation of Eritrea seems to be unraveling around the Ethiopian state. But let's go back to where we started. If the government does not provide the security that people need, if the government does not intervene in humanitarian, providing humanitarian aid to people who need it, then people will take matters into their own hands. What would be the prognosis when the situations are like that? Jawar, could you look forward, and what would be the way forward in this situation?
Look, what's happening is the remaining TPLF leaders are still using Meles Zenaw's playbook. Meles Zenaw is a worthy adversary, quite a brilliant tactician, and he did survive, but as René Lefort said, he left with a password. So what you have is a bunch of competing individuals and factions within TPLF trying to use Meles's playbook. Here's what they don't realize. 1, Meles is dead. 2, time has changed. The Oromo generation that they are facing today is not the generation that was facing Meles. In terms of number, in terms of resources, in terms of accumulated experiences, the Oromo struggle has produced, thousands, if not millions of activists, operational organizers, coordinators with a lot of sophistication, education, and a collective experience. So the way here's what they're thinking. You both were talking about how they want to deflect. They want to deflect the attention from the center into the periphery, into the border areas. But the level of Oromo nationalism, the level of Oromo consciousness has reached a level where you could pinch somebody in Moyale, that pain will be felt in Amphilo. And if they are watching, they're not listening what's happening. They are not understanding the population. The message was clear last week. The central issue that brought, the stay at home that shut down the country was one is number of issue of border. Remember, kids from Dambidolo and Nakamte have never heard Chin accent before that. Never. But they shut down the city. People shut down the city. The young, the old, the business people, everybody shut down. Why? The level of consciousness and resentment and solidarity has reached a level where you can try to deflect it by attacking Moyale or Chinaksan or Babile, but you still felt as if it's attacked at the heart of Dambidolo or at the heart of Ambo. So, what they are doing is really radicalizing and militarizing and strengthening the solidarity among the Oromo. And that's what they don't understand. Remember, they are incapable of learning. Let's take the issue of master plan. This physically, in reality, it would only affect people who live around Finfinne. But who died for it? Who fought for it? People in Guroa, people in Hidilola and Borana. So I don't think they understand that the Oromo have built such a critical mass that no amount of deflection will deter it. In terms of consequence, they're still, again, they're using Malas's playbook where we grew up listening to his threat, where if the PLF is not there, Ethiopia will collapse. The country will be in hell. Not only will Ethiopia collapse, everybody will be against each other's throat. They are wrong. I think the regime will collapse. I think the state will continue. And for that, of course, a lot of work will require. They are trying to scare people inside Ethiopia and the outside world that, look. If we are not around, Somalis and Oromos, they are going to kill each other. Look. If we are not around, if our militaries are not, if the boots are not on the ground, if the TPLF is not in power, there will be an all-out war against everybody. There will be mayhem. They are trying to do this. We are focusing on Oromia, but the situation is the same in Amhara region. They cut a huge chunk of land from the Amhara region and gave it to Sudan. The idea is to make sure Sudan and the Amhara region and the Amhara activists don't have any collaboration. Why? Because TPLF knows that it came on the back of the Sudanese support and other neighboring countries. But they are creating a conflict, a complicated situation. We should not undermine how merciless they are, how careless they are, let alone for the rest of the people, the subjugated population of the country. They don't even care for the Tigrayan population. How could somebody play with this kind of fire where a significant portion of their brothers and sisters reside in the south? So again, I don't think they will get the kind of consequence they expect, but I know for sure that what they are doing, it is costing us lives, it is costing us limbs, it is costing human life and resources, here and there. It is making the Oromo activists busy, but in the process, it is making us stronger. It is solidifying us. It's making our movement stronger. But what's really important is what the guy said, to make sure that they don't succeed in bringing down the country when they inevitably go down as a regime. Activists, leaders, scholars from all sides of the spectrum need to really watch this thing carefully, organize, mobilize, strategize, and work to ensure that the regime goes down without taking down the country with it.
Dr. Zagai, final thoughts?
I think one of the things that people would say is that there's all these pressures and this regime might collapse, and along with it, we might experience state collapse. Or others would say, well, there are lots of pressures. This is a very repressive regime, very authoritarian, both in its ideational structure and in its function. So in the end, it will be more authoritarian, more repression, and it will continue. Now, I do not think that is going to happen because people have just have woken up. People have just become ungovernable. And my hope is that this will be the last dictatorship in Ethiopia. And my hope is that when this regime goes down, as Jawar said, inevitably, the state shall survive, and probably from the ashes, it will be able to build a democracy that it has never known so far.
Yeah, we started by saying that this government in recent years has gone from one crisis to another. I think there are important issues that we should underline here and then conclude. As Jawar said, the death of the late prime minister was a seminal event. It was the man was the linchpin on the system or the systems that actually function in the country. That is, he was the man that could order every apparatus of the state, the security, the military, the party, and the other para-state organizations. He was the man at the top. He was the linchpin. So his removal is not just simply a man of ideas that was removed, but actually a man that actually built the regime and had complete control of it. So since then, this is why we see the crisis to crisis. Since his death, the state itself had started to unravel. We're just seeing the results of it right now. The second thing that Jawar talked about, it's not just the Oromo, but others as well, in other areas as well. It's not only the understanding of the rising consciousness about what's going on, but the pressure, the oppression, the increasing oppression is also solidifying the protest and the determination to seek change. That is important. In a way, the political system and the political landscape have changed, but the powers that be today do not understand it. One more thing. Dictatorship or states that collapse usually are dictatorships. Democracies don't fight, democracies don't collapse. They will be weakened, but they would not be lost. But dictatorships, because the only thing that they know is to use brute force, all they do is lead to regime collapse and, of course, state collapse. That has been a history of dictatorial regimes in Africa or elsewhere. Now, the specter of collapse is not just an hyperbolic discussion that we're having. We give evidence for it. Internally, and there is more to say about it, externally and institutionally and every other way. But the implication of state collapse in Ethiopia is not going to be limited to Ethiopia itself. It has implications for the entire region. This is a region where you have about 1 billion people living in the Horn of in Africa altogether, and maybe a quarter of that in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is the most populous state. Now, there are already failed states in that area. Somalia is a failed state. South Sudan is a failed state. This is also an area that has fragile states. Djibouti is a very difficult state as it is. Eritrea improving, but it's also a weak state. Now, in the middle of this is Ethiopia, one that was supposed to be economically strong, politically organized, and that is where it's occurring. So this implosion will have consequences far beyond Ethiopia itself. So it's incumbent on people who have any interest in that area, in stability and in averting disaster, human disaster, should pay attention to what we're saying today. So thank you very much. We will continue at some other time, but for today, this issue of raising the specter of collapse should do it for us. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating, Sky.